And now let's take a look at the latest situation in the U.S. where the anti-racism demonstrations still continue, but it appears that things are calming down a little bit now.
Yes, because the protest has already entered the 10th day over the death of George Floyd. And it looks like it's getting more peaceful, like you said, Kuntepchai, compared to the very first days of the demonstrations. As you can see that people are still continuing to raise their voices to demand change in the American society where racism is still a very big issue here. And right now we have Steve Herman, the White House Bureau Chief from Voice of America, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Hello.
Hello, Steve.
Yes,
welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
United States.
Thank you for joining us. So how's the current situation in Washington, D.C.? Are the protests still peaceful on your end?
There have been protests continuing every night. They've continued to build, although last night we did not have a curfew for the first time in many days. But we also had a pretty significant thunderstorm, so that literally dampened the crowd. However, what we're hearing is that on Saturday, there is expected to be the biggest rally yet. Some people are talking about hundreds of thousands of people that will show up for that event.
So what is the sentiment over there now that the police officers have all been charged?
Well, you mean in Minnesota? Yes, that definitely was something that was expected and a bit of a relief, but this is just the beginning for this movement, it appears, in the United States. Just because the officers have been arrested doesn't mean that everybody is going to leave the streets and then conclude that racial problems in the United States have ended. This looks like the beginning of a very significant movement. Also, possibly we're at an inflection point in United States history with the president continuing to focus on law and order rather than the issues of racial divide. And that really puts him in contrast with people such as Joe Biden, the former vice president, the Democrat, who is the presumptive nominee to face Donald Trump on the ballot here in the presidential election in November.
Before the George Floyd case, there have been similar cases, but at the end, the police end up being found not guilty. So why is it so difficult for the U.S. to solve this issue here?
Well, I think there's a number of different issues that we're talking about. When you're talking about convictions in a court of law, even Keith Ellison, who is an African American and the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, when announcing these charges against the additional officers on Thursday, said that it's going to be difficult to get convictions on these second-degree murder charges against the one particular officer. What you have a lot of times is you have very good lawyers that manage to get the cases dismissed, or a jury doesn't come back for a conviction, or there's some sort of plea bargain. Then there is the fundamental issue of what is perceived by African Americans and others that people of color in the United States are harassed by the police more, that they're pulled over, they're more likely to be killed in any sort of confrontation with law enforcement, and that this is racial bias. And then there is the third issue about society at large and putting new laws on the books and reining in the activities of the police. And we've even heard now the president of the city council in Minneapolis saying that she's going to have the Minneapolis Police Department disbanded and replaced by some other type of new public security force. That gives you an idea of the level of frustration.
Steve, as you just said, the police brutality against black people is nothing new here. But can you help explain to our Thai audience why this time around the reaction from the public is so intense or so widespread?
Well, I think a big difference is this time around you had an incident that lasted for many minutes, 8 minutes, that was videotaped. Everyone could clearly see what was going on. They could clearly hear what was going on. And there was really no way to spin that in any way that would have been sympathetic to the view of law enforcement officers. I think also we saw a large response on the streets because, frankly, people in the United States under this coronavirus pandemic had been sitting at home. People didn't have jobs to go to. There weren't classes to go to. It wasn't like, okay, we're going to protest tonight, but we have to get up early tomorrow morning to go to work or go to school. So there was ample time to hold these protests and to have them go on day after day. And then it can be argued that the response from the President of the United States, instead of being consoler-in-chief, came out with a lot of comments about law and order, that only exacerbated the incident and caused more fury among the protesters, who, of course, have not perceived the president generally being too sympathetic to minorities in this country, although the president will tell you he's done more for African Americans than any other president.
But it seems like President Trump has a very confrontational relationship with the media. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yes, that's how he got elected to office. That very much appeals to his base, to push back heavily against any criticism and to call the mainstream media fake news and enemies of the people. And so there's no reason we can see that he's going to stop now, especially since he believes that that sort of approach has worked for him to get him elected a first time. And now with 5 months before the election again, Trump is very much being Trump.
I think you must be doing a very dangerous job, out on the streets. Your colleagues also because a number of journalists have been assaulted by both sides of the demonstrations. So why do you think journalists have been targeted more than in the past?
Well, I think, as you noted, the president certainly has portrayed the media as the enemy, and also trust among Americans in general in the media is quite low. And it is a different era because in the past decades, I can tell you from being on the streets during demonstrations that the police would generally not target the media, and demonstrators would not target the media, but that is definitely happening these days. The media being seen as a kind of a symbol for, I guess, everyone to vent their frustrations at. And of course, perhaps the media does need to do some sort of introspection to figure out why this is happening. But the one thing that is different that I can tell you in decades past is that the domestic media in the United States itself is very polarized, where you have networks especially that tend to lean to the left or lean to the right. And that could be one explanation as well. But there's absolutely no excuse for the types of attacks that we've seen by demonstrators and police on still photographers, videographers, and reporters. And I think we've been quite fortunate so far that no one has been even more seriously hurt.
Yeah. So what do journalists have to be most careful about when they go out to cover these events?
Well, I think you need to have common sense. I've covered demonstrations on the streets of Bangkok and other cities around the world. And there's a difference, I think, among those of us who are veterans, who have covered demonstrations in many different countries, about precautions to take and not put yourself in the line of fire, so to speak, between demonstrators and law enforcement. But we do need to do our jobs. It's very important to document this and be as unbiased as possible. So as you said, it is dangerous, it is risky, but that's our job.
I see. So Steve, many Thai people have been caught by surprise by the level of violence caused by the demonstrations. How would you explain to this Thai watching what is going on in the U.S. as to why you have come to this point?
Well, I think one thing that's very important to emphasize is that at least 99% of the people out on the streets who are of all colors and races and ethnic backgrounds and ages are peaceful and are sincere in their intentions to peacefully demonstrate. There are a small number of troublemakers. Some are opportunists who are just looking to use this as an opportunity to vandalize and to loot. And then there are others who have extreme political causes, from what we can tell, both on the extreme left and the extreme right, who are also taking advantage of all that. And of course, when you have these acts of violence, there's a lot of attention by the authorities and by the media on these particular acts. And I can tell you that in Washington, D.C., in the early days when this started to happen, there was not a robust civilian police response to get to the scenes of the looting and apprehend the individuals. We've seen less of that in recent days in Washington, D.C., and also in other parts of the country, and hopefully the demonstrations from here on out will be of a peaceful nature.
But when we look at the protests, there are tons of people coming together, and it seems to be very crowded here, and there have been warnings that such protests can lead to the second wave of the coronavirus in the US. Are there any concerns that the masses of people will make the widespread even worse?
Absolutely. We've heard concerns from both local and national public health officials about this, predicting that there probably will be a spike upward in cases again. However, we do see a lot of people at these demonstrations wearing masks, but when you have that many people together in a close space, it is something to be concerned about. One upside is the weather is much warmer. There appears to be scientific evidence that this virus doesn't do well in sunlight and warmer temperatures. So if people are wearing masks and the weather is warm, that could mitigate it to some degree. But we are expecting to see an uptick in cases again. It'll be a number of days after these demonstrations before we can see that in the epidemiological data. But absolutely, that is a concern.
So, Steve, how do you see things will develop in the next few days?
Well, it's really hard to predict, but I think a lot depends on whether there are these sort of violent opportunists that continue to mix in, and how severely law enforcement responds. Of course, if we see a continuation of police brutality, there was a case in Buffalo, New York on Thursday night where a 75-year-old man was shoved with apparently no provocation by some police officers, knocked to the ground, was bleeding from his head and is in serious condition in the hospital. Those types of scenes enrage people. So we need to see restraint by law enforcement and also demonstrators and organizers to keep their rallies peaceful. We have seen some of that in Washington, where in recent days when people tried to start to do some acts of vandalism, that others in the crowd that told them that was wrong and to stop it. So it is a very interesting time right now. I think it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. Is this going to continue to escalate, or is it going to fizzle out? There does seem to be some sincerity among police departments, the leaders at least around the country, to address these racial injustices. But people want to see more leadership on this coming from the federal government itself. And the president has not given a national speech about this. He is continuing to tweet about a variety of topics. And when he does talk about the George Floyd case, his emphasis has been on law and order rather than the core root of the grievances of the demonstrators.
Steve, from what we have been reading from the U.S. media, we believe that the demonstrations have been spontaneous and the demonstrations are leaderless. Is that the case?
I think in the vast majority of cases that this is not being orchestrated by any particular movement. You have a number of different grassroots groups who have come together, and sometimes you will see people with bullhorns trying to exhort the crowd, and then the emphasis by the U.S. Attorney General and others has been to accuse Antifa of an extreme left-wing anti-fascist group of causing the violence. And while there may be some individuals who adhere to that cause, we cannot say that this is being led by extreme left elements by any stretch of the imagination. So yes, it does appear to a great degree to be a sort of a spontaneous grassroots uprising in the country, and that has been the case in other types of demonstrations in recent years in this country as well.
All right, Steve, thank you very much. Your perspectives are very much appreciated.
Always my pleasure.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hope to speak to you again, soon. All right.
Stay safe as well.
All right. Okay. Okay, that was Steve Herman. And we forgot to mention the fact that Steve was in Bangkok as a correspondent for VOA. Right? Yeah.
He has a lot of experience reporting in Bangkok and in many cities in Asia before moving back to the US, covering the protests that are going on right now.